The decision to impose VAT on private school fees effective from today has sparked intense debate. Is it fair? Is it legal? And has the civil service upheld its duty of impartiality in the process, or has it crossed a political Rubicon? It's worth unpacking some of these issues. I can't be absolutely thorough because A, I'm not a lawyer, and B, I don't have a huge amount of time, and there are cases ongoing through the courts, with six families in particular taking a case through the High Courts and seeking anonymity in the process, which makes it particularly complex to unpick the details. Proponents argue that this is a Robin Hood policy, redistributing wealth to improve state education, and Labour estimates that it will raise £1.7 billion annually to fund initiatives like recruiting 6,500 new teachers. Critics contend that this measure disproportionately harms less wealthy families relying on smaller, low-fee schools or those with special needs children without formal education, health and care plans, EHCPs, which take up to 2 years to establish. They argue it entrenches elitism as the wealthiest schools like Eton remain unaffected. I think it's also worth pointing out that not all private schools are charities, and not all private schools similarly attract wealthy patrons or wealthy clients, wealthy families. VAT exemption from education has historical roots, treating education as a public good rather than a taxable commodity, and critics argue that removing this exemption undermines that principle. The Independent Schools Council, the ISC, is challenging the move in court, claiming it violates the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, specifically Article 2, a right to education, and Article 14, protection from discrimination. But the Labour Party have claimed that the VAT exemption is a tax break. VAT exemption and tax breaks differ fundamentally, and this use of this language in a sort of emotive way and a vague way at the same time is worrying from the government and from civil servants. A tax break is a targeted incentive within the tax system. An exemption is the absence of tax for specific goods or services, removing them from the VAT framework altogether. Treasury claims that the VAT exemption is a tax break, and therefore that is contentious. Critics, including Conservative MPs like Jesse Norman, argue that labelling the absence of VAT as a break is misleading and politicises technical tax policy. The Treasury's language implies bias, potentially breaching the Civil Service Code, which mandates integrity, objectivity and impartiality. Further on this civil service neutrality, the Treasury's language mirrors Labour's rhetoric, undermining again its impartiality. Priti Patel called the department a mouthpiece for Labour's left-wing government, accusing it of violating the civil service code. And government departments have historically echoed political messaging. For example, the Treasury tweets in the Sunak era promoted phrases like "let's stick to the plan." So while controversial, such practices that Priti Patel highlights rarely result in legal challenges or sanctions, but framing an exemption removal as a tax break risks misleading the public. Smaller schools, the economic fallout of this is that smaller schools may close, displacing thousands of students into state schools, straining resources, creating localised crises in education. An IFS report predicts only 3 to 7% of private school students will move to state schools. But even this modest shift could increase government spending by up to £300 million annually, reducing the policy's net benefit. Schools will face additional costs for VAT compliance, from system upgrades to partial exemption rules, and issues around mixed supplies, boarding versus day schooling, ancillary service like catering, add layers of bureaucratic uncertainty. And all this to be managed in an incredibly short period of time, within 6 months from when the policy was announced, when the policy was enacted, and when the policy was actually active. The families argue in the Human Rights Challenge that the VAT policy disproportionately affects vulnerable groups such as faith-based schools, SEND schools, and send students without EHCPs and minority communities. The judicial review seeks to challenge VAT under the ECHR, but success is uncertain, and historically courts defer to governments on fiscal matters unless clear discrimination is demonstrated. The VAT on private schools embodies competing values: fairness in public funding education versus the right to educational choice. And while its legality under domestic laws seems straightforward, human rights challenges add complexity. I think those human rights challenges would be significantly more efficacious if the families who are taking those challenges were to be named rather than to remain anonymous. The civil services neutrality and anonymity there remains questionable, while the Treasury, walking a fine line between communications and politicisation, is doing so here, and with the tractor tax, and with the issues about the pension, the fuel for pensioners. And in this fraught landscape, clarity and fairness are paramount, but possibly intangible. For now, the policy generates more questions than answers, legal, logistical, and moral alike. And it sets I think the most worrying thing is it sets a precedent for future governments to act with knee-jerk impunity to implement changes so fast that they cannot be challenged. And for Priti Patel to be one of the lone voices speaking out against this policy is ironic, given the fact that she and Suella Braverman basically laid the framework, laid the groundwork for this sort of political move in putting forward the Rwanda plan to be knee-jerked through with a redefinition of what is illegal or an illegal migrant and so on. You change the law with this suddenness and you set a precedent. And the precedent was set by Priti Patel and Suella Braverman, and now they see it enacted in different areas and they scream foul. Well, they started it. This very, very worrying genie out of the bottle. The consequences of doing something so novel are disturbing. I think this is a disturbing law. I think this enshrines that principle that a government can ride roughshod over whichever part of the population it wants to harry. And I think we need to challenge this simply on the basis of time. The same thing is true of the tractor tax. The inheritance tax should be applied on a 7-year basis. Anything to do with education should be applied on at least a 3-year basis. Anything less than that, anything that is enacted within a matter of months, should raise eyebrows, no matter whether there's an election or not. This is nasty politics, and nasty politics was introduced in full force by the last government, and we now see the consequence of that.